Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# user group. A little bit about the group. We meet every month. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover any and all topics related to .NET. You can find the meeting information posted at meetup.com at the link listed at the bottom of the slide. As always, we'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors, PostSharp and DevExpress, for sponsoring the licenses that will be raffled off using the meeting eval forms. We'd like to thank the .NET Foundation for sponsoring the Meetup website, and last but not least, NIS Technologies for sponsoring the virtual meeting space. For those that are new to the group, we have an offer from Manning.com for a 35% off a selection of books using the discount code MTPCLEC21, and the link as well as the discount code will be available in chat in just a few minutes. So some general information, if you're joining us for the first time, this serves as a platform for people to showcase their skills as well as for others to learn from them. And so with that said, please keep in mind participation is always encouraged. And like I always say, the only stupid question is the one not being asked. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphones just to avoid any unexpected background noise. And we always like to keep it casual but organized, so feel free to jump in with any questions or comments, either verbally or in the chat window. But at the same time, we want to give our presenter enough time to go through the demos and the slides. Lastly, the question on everyone's mind, is the meeting being recorded? Yes, and it will be posted on YouTube in just a few short days after the editing process. And so with that, it brings us to tonight's feature presentation, Building Distributed Apps with .NET Aspire by Cecil Phillip. Cecil joins us from the Fort Lauderdale area. He has over 15 years of software development experience, working for organizations finance, education, HR, and healthcare industries. He's also a developer advocate at Stripe and the community manager for the Dapper project. And as you can tell, with all these heavy-duty involvements, he has a passion for teaching and helping others. And we're definitely happy to have him with us tonight. And with that, let me turn over the screen over to Cecil. Cecil, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Sam, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone that decided to spend your evening with me tonight. Definitely appreciate you. Yeah, I got a quick introduction. Sam, thank you for that introduction, first of all. But yeah, for folks that don't know me, I mean, I've been in the .NET space for a long time. Spending a lot of time building backend things, web APIs, messaging things, doing a lot of that type of work. And throughout my years, I've worked at Microsoft, I work at Stripe now, but throughout my years, I've always found most of my joy and passion in just hanging out with folks and learning about what their problems are and trying to find ways that I can help them solve, whatever issues it is that they're working on. So hopefully, wherever y'all are watching from, because I realize everyone is virtual. I didn't know if this was going to be a in-person thing or not. I hope that you learn something from this. If at any point in time you can't understand what I'm saying, if you want me to repeat anything, feel free to stop me. I have the chat window open in the corner, so obviously I'll be paying attention. But feel free to ask a question, unmute, send me a message, whatever the case is. And, I'll do my best to either rewind, re-explain. Because, again, my goal is just to make sure that you all understand what's going on and, everything that's happening here today. So with that out of the way, what we're here to learn about is about .NET Aspire. For folks that may not have heard about it before, essentially it's a way that we the way Microsoft has developed to make it a little bit easier for us to build microservices. I don't know how many folks in the room have built microservices or are building microservices. Maybe we could do a quick chat poll. So if folks are building microservices, of using Kubernetes or Docker or anything of the sort, if those are tools that you're using and you're familiar with, maybe you could just drop a message in the chat so I could take a peep over and see what folks are doing and folks are working on. Always good to hear what folks are kind of doing in that space. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of how we got here, right? How did we get to this state, and then talk a little bit about what Aspire is and how it helps solve some of the problems that we have today. And then, obviously there'll be some demos and, again, hopefully you'll be able to get your questions answered and just get a better understanding about what exactly .NET Aspires. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and kick it off? So, with me working on distributed systems for just a little bit, one of the things that I realized throughout, this period of time is, building distributed applications is hard. And it's not hard because just of the business problems that are related to it, but there's just so many different things as developers we really need to pay attention to and think about. How do I scale this up, right? How do I deal with those transient errors, right? We know as developers, you cannot trust the network, right? The network's up, it's down, it's all around, right? How do we deal with changing infrastructures? How do we deal with trying to find the right pieces of the components to put together to make the types of applications that we're trying to build? So as someone that's spending time trying to again put those puzzle pieces together, there's so many different questions you probably want to ask yourself. You know what I mean? How do I get the URL set up and running? How do I do local testing? You know what I mean? How do I set up monitoring, and how do I get those different components running? All of these different things that you ask yourself, right? And this is before you even start building your application, right? We're still just trying to put the puzzle pieces together. One, we have to choose those pieces, but then we have to try and see what's the right configuration, what's the right setup, what's the right port numbers and system configurations and dependencies that we need just to get those things running. And then eventually you're I give up. I can't take this anymore. It's just too much for me to do. Because this is not what we want to do, right? We want to build applications. We want to spend time adding business value because that's what we do as developers, right? We want to add business values. I used to tell one of my old coworkers all the time, I'm not in the business of, trying to do, configuration. This is what our network ops guys are for. This is what the DevOps folks are for. I'm here to, build out these business requirements, right? I'm here to build out these APIs and, write these Blazor clients and all these types of things, right? That's what I'm here to do. And so what's happened over time is within the .NET space, the team has really just been adding these bits and pieces of nuggets, right? I call them the puzzle pieces. You'll hear me say that a lot, right? You've been seeing the team add these puzzle pieces together. And I think in the beginning, it wasn't intentional, right? It wasn't intentional from the perspective of, oh, we want to be the best cloud native distributed system framework at the time. But when you kind of look back at it, it just kind of made sense, right? These were natural things that we were doing anyway. When I think about help checks and working with reverse proxies, I was doing a lot of that stuff back in 2009, 2010, right? So these are not new concepts for a lot of us. But I think what's different when we start talking about cloud native is not necessarily just new technology. I think it's just the way that we're applying new ideas, or rather old ideas to new problems, right? And then, the way that we apply those ideas, it looks like something new and it looks like something different. Again, reverse proxies are not a new thing, right? Being able to do health checks and retries are not a new thing, right? Trying to build applications that, reduce the size of the bundle, those are not new things. But now that we're trying to go into this cloud native world, right? This world of containers and Kubernetes and, orchestration systems, now we're just thinking about them in a different way. Now we're applying those patterns in a different way. And so, when I look at .NET, I feel like we've had these pieces, right? We've had these puzzle pieces kind of being developed over time. But now we want to focus on, well, how can we put them together, right? How can we put them together in a package that works well inside of this new cloud native world that we're all trying to, be a part of? So what are some of the things that we kind of think about, right, when we think about what cloud native is? Or what are some of the additional things that we want to, include in that space as we're building our applications? And some of those things include observability, right? The ability to know what's happening in my application, logging and tracing and metrics, right? You hear folks talk about open telemetry when they particularly talk about that stuff in the cloud native space. Being able to be resilient, right? In this cloud native world, you might have a service that has multiple instances. What happens if one of them goes down? How do I know what the new IP address is? How do I find it? How do I get there? How do I know if it's up and it's ready? How do I know if it's healthy? How do I know if it's overburdened with work and I should choose a new instance, right? How am I able to scale? How am I able to manage all these different things, right? These are just some of the things that we think about, again, when we're inside of that mindset of building cloud native applications. And again, with .NET 8, we got a whole lot of additional support, right? And a lot of new features that the .NET team was able to kind of create for us. So again, better support for metrics and even better support for logging and redaction. If folks have never seen the log redaction stuff, it's pretty cool, right? It's how you can able to, quote unquote, redact PII, right? Like, really sensitive information in your logs. You know what I mean? New support for poly packages and the AOT stuff, right? Like these are a lot of the things that have been coming out, from the .NET space. But again, more stuff doesn't mean it's better, right? Like what we've been getting is more stuff. And more stuff is good. I don't want to say like we don't want it. We definitely want it. But then the problem is, right, is that we're kind of compounding on what I like to call the microservice matrix. If folks have ever, again, any of you have ever built microservices before, and you've ever heard me, in previous talks talk about the microservice matrix, essentially it's just the idea of, in this space today, there's just so many options, so many things to set up, so many puzzle pieces to put together. And again, I'd rather have the puzzle pieces than not have them. But then now that we have them, and we have a lot of them, it becomes really complex for us to get started because we have so many choices to choose from. As an example, one of the concerns we have with microservices and distributed systems is messaging, right? If I need to send a message from one service, one microservice, or one instance of a service to another, what am I going to use, right? Maybe I'm going to use a message broker. What message broker am I going to use? Am I going to use Amazon's message broker? Am I going to use RabbitMQ? Am I going to use NATS? Am I going to use MQTT? Like, there's just so many things for me to choose from, right? And to be honest with you, it's probably going to take me like maybe a whole sprint to sit down and evaluate and try and figure out, well, is this the right tool for the job that I'm trying to, achieve, for the goals that I'm trying to execute on? Does it have the features that I want? Does it have, the ability for me to run and debug it locally? Is it a cloud hosted service? You know what I mean? Does it support my language and my framework? Does it support my operating system? Right? Like all of these questions that you have to ask yourself as you're just choosing the components that you want to run in this space. And generally, this makes it a very difficult thing to do. So kind of looking back in the past a little bit, some of you may or may not have remembered a project called Project Tie. And Project Tie was an experiment. Even though I know a lot of us had put it in production, it was not meant to be in production. It was an experiment. And the goal of Project Tie was really for not only just the .NET team, but like us as an ecosystem to really start to think about like what exactly do we need from a local development perspective when it comes to building out microservices, right? And some of the challenges that a lot of us in the space had was, how do I run multiple instances of a service? How do I run all of my services for that matter? I might have a solution that has four web APIs and 2 front ends, and then now I have to go into Visual Studio and I have to tweak my build configurations and all this types of stuff just to get it running. But then again, what if I want to run multiple instances of that, right? Like what if I want to be able to try out my load balancing logic, right? What if I want to be able to see what happens if one of them fails and one of them is not, right? Folks will listen to that and hear about things like chaos engineering, right? How can I simulate those types of things on my machine? And so Project Tie was one of the first experiments, or one of many experiments that happened, to be able to have us kind of look and think about how do we build applications that live in that space. And again, Project Tie was an experiment, and so eventually, like most experiments, it came to an end. But I think through that, a lot of folks, started to think very differently about .NET and think about, well, how exactly can we enable these types of experiences as we're trying to move into this cloud native world of like Docker and Docker Compose and Kubernetes and Nomad and all these other orchestration tools, that run our applications in a very different way than what we're used to. So that being said, enough of a history lesson. So now today, what we have is .NET Aspire, right? Aspire was announced in .NET Conf last November. So that was November 2023. And essentially, this is the .NET team solution for how we're going to locally build and hopefully eventually deploy microservices built specifically on .NET, right? This is a .NET specific solution. We're trying to be able to figure out like what does this cloud native space look like for us, right? As we're talking today, like .NET Aspire is not GTA or GTM or whatever. It's not ready for production. It is very much in the state of a preview. I think the team is doing monthly previews, sometimes bi-monthly. I think they released like 2 previews this month. So they're wrapping up fast and they're moving really quickly. But again, just for the sake of safety, this is not something that we want to look at as, oh, we got to take this and throw it in production. So also, I'm going to show you some demos. Some of them might work and some of them might not work. I'm only saying that because, again, this is something that is very much in preview, right? Like bits change, things move around. But I definitely think it's worth taking a look at and paying attention to, particularly if you're in that space of like building these microservices and building these distributed applications. So what is Aspire, right? So Aspire essentially is like a very opinionated, excuse me. Aspire essentially is a very opinionated stack, right? It's not a framework, it's not a library, it's a stack, right? It's a collection of a bunch of different components that help you achieve like some of those concerns that we showed a little bit earlier when it comes to building microservices, like resiliency and scalability and management. How do I handle being able to do telemetry and some of these types of things, right? Like how do I do health checks and all of this types of stuff. Now, like we said early in the beginning too, like we've had these components for a while. We've had them separately. But what Aspire does is that it allows us to kind of package them all a little bit neatly together. It makes it easier for us to get started. And it gives us an opinionated perspective of what does it mean to build a cloud native, or at least start building a cloud native application using .NET, right? It has a whole bunch of different components in it. It has a lot of different capabilities like support for open telemetry, support for wiring up and setting up containers in your dev machine. And we're going to see how some of that stuff works like as we get into the demo, right? And again, with Aspire being a stack, I definitely want you to think about it as, there's bits and pieces of it that you could use in your applications today, and there's bits and pieces of it that are still being worked on, right? I feel like Aspire is very much of like an evolving story that, we're going to be a part of that story for like a very long time. It's very much a collection of puzzle pieces. So, you might use some pieces now and some pieces you might never use, right? Again, it's really about you and your application and knowing, well, what are the things that are available that I want to really pay attention to? As an example here, like, there's a lot of new packages around resilience, particularly HTTP resilience. And this particularly has to do with some of the work they did with the Poly team to make it a lot more memory efficient, a lot more performance when it comes to like, building some of those HTTP pipelines out. I don't know if folks have ever used Poly or heard about Poly, but if you have, go ahead and let me know in the chat. Maybe we can talk about that for a second. Again, additional support for adding telemetry and testing and also doing like some of that log redaction as well, right? Like tons of great stuff. But again, these are all individual components, right? But now what you'll see in a second is I'm going to show you how Aspire actually helps us put it together. And then I'm going to show you a quick demo of like what it actually looks like to build an Aspire application. So let me switch over. I'm going to head over to my Visual Studio. Excuse me. I was testing this out really quick just before we started. So I'm going to close this and I'm going to create a new Aspire application. Let me know if you can see it. Hopefully everyone's screen looks fine. I'm just going to call this, I'll just call this Aspire demo. Sure. Now I'm going to use the starter application template, right? And I'm just going to go ahead and create that, right? So again, this is a brand new application, not something that I pre-prepared. I didn't do anything special with it. But again, I really just want to let you see what exactly it looks like when you first create an Aspire application. Now, I don't know if you can see it or not, but on the left side, I have 4 projects that got created, right? Now, the main project that I want you to pay attention to is the app host. I'm not going to show you what the code looks like yet, but I am just going to run it. So here, and I'm using JetBrains Writer, but obviously it works very well in Visual Studio. I'm going to go ahead and run this. I'm just going to hit the run button. I'm not going to debug it. And let's just wait and see what it does. And of course, like I said before, if anyone has any questions, let me know. But if not, then I'm just gonna run this. And of
Cecil,
course,
you said Visual Studio, like Visual Studio proper or Visual Studio Code or both?
Visual Studio proper. Visual Studio Code does not have good support for Aspire today. So right now it's a Visual Studio proper thing. So if you're a VS Code person, you are going to have to use the command line to run the application and then attach the process. You could always debug things that way. But in terms of like, in Visual Studio, there's the C# dev kit. The C# dev kits in Visual Studio right now does not have very good support for Aspire. Any other questions from folks? No. All right. So let's keep going. So what you're looking at right now is the Aspire dashboard, right? The Aspire dashboard essentially just shows me all the applications that I have running, right? All the applications that I have that are part of this quote unquote cloud native microservice solution. But it gives me a bunch of other stuff as well, right? Like I can see, the ports and, the endpoints that they're running on. I can look at the logs. If I look in details, I can see things like my configuration, my environment variables, some of the different settings it has. And if I take a look here on the left side, you'll notice that I have options to take a look at, again, the console. The console really is just me being able to select the streaming logs, right? So as things happen in my application, am I just doing regular logger.log, right? I have this centralized console that I could just look at, and I could, go between these different services, right? These different applications, and see exactly what's happening there. We have structured logs, we have traces, we have metrics. We'll take a look at these a little bit later on. But when you first run your Aspire application, this is what you're gonna get, right? Now, the main demo is this web front end thing, right? I'm gonna go ahead and click on that. This may or may not look familiar to some of you. This is really just the typical, front end that we see all the time. Maybe with Blazor or with, any of those types of things that we do. So the only thing I'm doing right now, you may or may not notice, but I'm just kind of like clicking around because I'm just trying to generate some traffic, right? I'm just trying to get this to move around a little bit. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to make you see that because this application has been orchestrated with some interesting defaults, and we'll take a look at what some of those defaults are, I'm able to not just get the logs, but I'm able to get traces and metrics about how this application is running. And the only thing I did was create this new application template and run it, and all that stuff just got wired up for me. So if I head over to metrics, as an example, I'm going to head over to this web front end, and you can see that, well, I could kind of scroll around here, and I could get all of these different metrics about what exactly has happened in this app. If I take a look at maybe some of these HTTP client metrics, I could see, here's this graph, 6:27. What time is it now? It's 6:30 my time. So, just not too long ago, right? Like we just created this application, started clicking around. And if you kind of, take a look at it for a second, you realize this is actually ticking. Like the actual graph is moving. This is a live graph of information, of metrics that are happening inside of your application. Right, we have different metrics like, we could see the routes that are matched. There's SignalR metrics in here, right? If, you have SignalR in your application. Tons of these different things that are available for you, right? If folks are familiar with tracing, right, we have distributed traces enabled as well. If I select this, for example, and I just, decided to look at the details for this particular trace, I can see, oh, look, my web front end made a request to this API service, right? And then after that request returned, my app continued running. That's essentially what this is showing me here. But this means that now I have the ability to look and see like what applications are talking to what, like what's the direction that the communication between these apps are happening. Who's requesting what? Who's sending messages to who, right? Again, I have done nothing yet, right? All I've done is just create this application and run it. But then because this application has been orchestrated with .NET Aspire, I'm able to get some of these interesting insights locally on my machine as I'm starting to build stuff out, right? Let me know if that makes sense for you all. I'm going to head over to, my IDE in a second. But as I do that, again, definitely stop and ask me any questions about that if you want to. So back in, excuse me, back in my application. So when I first created it, I got 4 projects. I have 2 application projects. There's a web front end and then there's a web API backend. I'm going to show you those projects first, and then I'm going to show you the Aspire parts first, just so that you could see that there's no magic happening here. There's nothing crazy and out of the way happen. So if I open this web backend, I'm sorry, the web front end. Again, this is just, it's a Razor Components, application. Again, nothing too crazy is happening here. I'm going to open up some of the pages. Again, just if folks are familiar with Razor, you can see, again, nothing out of the ordinary is in here. Nothing different is inside of this app. Here's the weather component. Nothing crazy is happening in here. We have a weather API client, and that's just making some requests over to that weather API backend, right? All that's happening locally in my machine. If I take a look at that client, again, I'm just making an HTTP request, right? It's making an HTTP request to the /weather forecast class, weather forecast endpoint. Nothing crazy, nothing different than what you'd usually build in .NET, right? Like this all looks very familiar to you. If I take a look at the API, this is the last thing we're going to look at before we actually look at the Aspire bits. I mean, this is it, right? We, set some stuff up. We, build or add services, and here's like that default minimal API stuff, and I'm just returning stuff, right? Or the template is just returning stuff for you, right? And that's it. And that's all that's happening in these other projects. Now, where does the fun stuff happen, right? Like, where do we start to quote unquote aspirify our application? If I head over to the app host, I'm going to click on this program.cs file. And here, now we start to get into what they like to call the orchestrator, right? One of the components that you get from .NET Aspire is a local orchestrator. I want to emphasize local. This is not something that you deploy. This is not something that you put in a container or it goes to the cloud with you. This is something only for local development. And so what you do with the local orchestrator is that you let it know, these are the projects that I want to run. So here you can see on line 3, right here, right? I'm saying, hey, I want you to give me a reference to API service, right? You can call this whatever you want to call it, right? API service there's nothing special about it other than that's just what the template decided to call it. You can call it API, you can call it weather service, you can call it whatever you want. Doesn't matter, right? The whole point is that I'm getting an actual programmable reference to my project. It's very same thing with the web front end, right? Like I have a programmable reference to that web front end, right? That web front end that I showed you that was built with Blazor components. The difference now is, as you can see on line 6 and 7, is that I'm able to add references from one project to the other, right? So here, see on line 7, right? I'm letting my orchestrator know, right? Because again, what we're building here is like a local orchestrator. I'm letting my orchestrator know that this project, this web front end, needs to talk to that backend, right? And so I'm going to give it a reference. And now when I build my application, right, the only thing that I need to run, again, and this is very different. If folks are familiar with using Visual Studio and setting up multiple projects to run at the same time, this is not the same thing. This is very different, right? It looks the same just because it'll get references to your project. It will build and run them for you. But this is not a Visual Studio thing. This is not a MS Build configuration thing, right? This is .NET actually creating a reference to your project, looking at the CS proj, running a build, and then setting it up for you. But then also, I'm able to add a reference from one project to the other. Now, what does that reference do? Well, essentially what it does is it lets me know, well, one, this is my dependency, but it also lets me know where it is, right? If I head back over to this web front end, here you go, this is it. If I look in my app settings.json file, if I look in my app settings.development.json file, you'll notice that there is nothing in there that's letting me know what is the port and the URL for that web API service. Nothing's telling me, right? So that means that if it changes, if If it goes down, if something happens to it, if I put it on a different machine, only thing that's happening is that my orchestrator is able to like pass that around in configuration, right? But like again, I don't have to know what that is. I don't have to set that up, right? That's something that it does for me. What do I need to do to get started? Dev tools, SDKs, NuGets, etc. What do you need to do to get started with .NET Aspire? Well, one, .NET Aspire is a .NET 8 project today, right? So you need to have .NET 8 installed. And then honestly, the only thing you need to do is make sure you install the workload, right? If folks are familiar with workloads when it comes to .NET, I'm going to pull up my command line here really quickly just to kind of show you what this looks like. In Visual Studio, this is very different. But like if you're on a Mac or if you're working in command line, you essentially will just do .NET workload search or list or install or whatever the case is. .NET workload install Aspire. That's all I have to do because I'm on a Mac. If you're in Visual Studio, I have a feeling it'll just kind of like automatically do it for you whenever you try to create it from the template, right? But that's it, right? Everything else is just happens for you, right? So you don't need to install anything extra other than just making sure that you have the workload. But again, what's happening here is that, again, I'm connecting my two projects together. So now when they run, the web front end knows where the API service is, right? And it knows it because the orchestrator, right, the thing that I'm running here is letting it know, right? It's passing it around in configuration. So if I was supposed to take a look and head back over to this weather API client, actually, let's go and take a look and see where it's registered. Okay, here we go. If folks are familiar with HTTP client factory, this is really all that's happening here, right? But when they set the base address, notice what the base address is set to, right? The base address is set to API service, right? Where did that come from? That came from right here, right? Because that's the name that we gave the project. So now if I head back over to my to this registration, this is just saying, hey, I want you to make a call over, or I want this web API, this HTTP client to be attached to a base address, whatever the base address of the API services. So now whenever it makes a call to like /weather or /weather ID, right, that's where it's going to go, right? Like that's what it's going to use and it's going to be able to resolve that, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, one of the things that you get from Aspire, other than the fact that, again, I can orchestrate these apps, what I just showed you was it has built-in support for service discovery. And that's essentially what's happening here, right? Instead of me hard-coding URLs and port numbers and these types of things, where like I can make use of the service discovery, feature that's built into it. Again, we're talking about puzzle pieces, right? Like we're taking bits and pieces of stuff and kind of putting them together so it can make sense to you. But another thing that Aspire has, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is components. But before we start talking about components, let's head back over to the slide really quickly. So what I just showed you really quickly with Aspire was the local app model, right? What the app model does is using code, and we're not using YAML. I don't know how folks feel about YAML, but like there's no YAML here, right? There's no YAML or there's no JSON file or XML file needed to configure or orchestrate your applications. This is all happening in code. It's all happening in C#, right? But essentially one of the things that Aspire does, it gives you an app model that represents what your application looks like. So what I showed you just now is, I created a distributed application builder. And that builder, I was able to say, well, I need you to add the web front-end project. I need you to add the web API project. And the web front-end needs to know where the API is, right? Now, I just showed you it from the context of adding, local files that you have already. Like, there's nothing really exciting and interesting about that. But another thing that it does is I can model containers, I can model executables, I can model scripts, I can model projects that are not inside of my solution file. I can add support for running Node.js applications. I can run Angular and React applications that have their own project JSON, NPM build model, right? I can run things that are in the cloud, right? I could say, hey, my application needs access to Azure Service Bus. My application needs access to Cosmos DB. My application needs to send metrics and telemetry over to application insights, right? Like these are just some of the things that are available based on this application model. And we do it all in code. And we don't write a single line unless you want to. You can write configuration, but you don't really have to write any configuration if you don't want to, right? Now, another thing that Aspire comes with is this collection of components, right? I just told you a little while ago, like, sure, like we can add projects, but this is something that you do in Visual Studio today. Like, there's nothing exciting about that. But in addition to that, Aspire comes with like a collection of pre-built components. So I think today, let me see if I can do this for you really quick. For instance, today, if I head over to NuGet, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, and I just type in Aspire. Or you could do this inside of Visual Studio if you want. But if I do that, you can notice that there's an Aspire Stack Exchange Redis. There's an Aspire RabbitMQ. There's Aspire for Postgres. There's Aspire for, putting stuff in Azure, right? All of these, there's Aspire for, what's this thing? Storage blobs, right? All this is just different components and different ways that you can encode, let Aspire know, or let the local orchestrator know, these are the things that I need you to run whenever I hit F5. And when you hit F5, it'll spin up the container, it'll run your executable, it'll provision whatever resources you need in the cloud for development purposes. I'm going to keep saying that. For development purposes, or if you have one already, you'll just connect to the thing that you already need. And then now you're able to run and debug and explore your application with 4 instances of your APIs, with a queuing system and databases and all this types of stuff, right? And you just had to define that once inside of your app host, which makes a lot of sense. Now, again, one of the great things that you get from Aspire is, the addition of, again, support for OpenTelemetry and health checks, you know what I mean? And the support for configuring that in one way so that now if I have 5 projects in there, if I have 20 projects in there, right? The way that they export telemetry and raise health checks, the way that we configure them is all the same. It's all consistent. So you don't have to go and figure out, oh, okay, man, how do I set up this thing to go do that thing? And how does these things talk to each other and all of that, right? Like a lot of that work has now been taken away from you. Now you have the option, if there's support for a tool or component that you don't see in a NuGet package or you've never used before, obviously you can definitely take your time and add that. You can create that yourself, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But again, at the end of the day, for me, the value is, hey, I can just continue building applications the way I'm used to building them. I could use the tools, HTTP, gRPC, I can use SignalR and WebSockets, right? But now I could start playing in this distributed systems world, doing a lot of cool things without having to set up a lot of different, requirements. Here's some of the components that today work out of the box really well with Aspire. These are not all the components, but again, this is just like a very short list because this is what I could fit on the slide. But this is just a very short list of some of the components that you could use inside of there. So again, RabbitMQ and MongoDB and NATS. If folks have ever used Dapper, I'm a big Dapper fan. I'm a Dapper community manager, so I had to make sure I had that on the slide. But if you use Microsoft Orleans or Azure or Node.js, right, like you have the opportunity to orchestrate a lot of this types of stuff inside of your application. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the second demo? This demo is going to be a little bit more involved, and I already wrote it. So let's open up the Aspire shop. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and run the application first, just like I did with the last one. But then I'm going to show you. Oh, I don't want to do that. Oops, let's not do that. Yeah, I'm going to come back and show you how it's set up, how the telemetry works, and like how some of those components are all running together. And just like the last one, this is running in the wrong window. So I'm going to pull this over here for you for a second. All right. Now, as you can see, there's way more components in here than the last one, right? There's more things inside of my application. If we kind of just look here on the left side, just starting out really quickly, you can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have a couple of containers. I have an executable. There's a database thing in here. I have 4 projects in here, right? There's a lot more things that are running. But I want you to realize like how quickly I hit run and all these things started, right? I didn't start it before the talk. I didn't have it pre-warmed up. I just hit it, and now I have all these things running, and they're up and they're ready to go, right? I've pulled down I pulled on a few different containers. I'm using, what's inside of here? Right, I'm using Vault, right? I have a container that's running, this is probably a better place to show you, right? I have a container that's running Vault. I have Postgres in here, and I have Redis in here that's doing some caching for me. And I have the endpoints for all of those things. Again, just like before, I have the logs and I have the details to see exactly what's happening. Now, I'm going to run this application. Again, my endpoint is here, so I'll just kind of click around and let's see what it does. And this is not doing anything super crazy. I'm going to click, 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 clickety click, just generating some traffic, right? Notice here my little counter thing is going up. I'm going to go ahead and check out. Oh, that's not good. That's not a part of the demo. Let's stop this and run this again. See what happens. Again, like I said, sometimes things are not going to work. This is just kind of the state of what happens when you run demos on preview software. All right, let's try and run this again. Let's see what happens. Right, let's clickety click the thing. Let's run checkout. Okay, great. Now it's working. Now, this essentially is just running a checkout session. I'm not going to go through this and tell you what it's doing, at least not in this checkout window. But the only thing that's important is that I want you to notice that like I'm using containers, I'm using a third-party service, right? And I have multiple projects that are all kind of running and doing stuff for me. Now, I have this application front end. This application front end is making requests to the back end. The back end is a separate project. And this project is essentially just returning product information for me, right? I have a I have a Redis queue. My Redis queue is essentially like, controlling the basket for me. So anytime I add something to the shopping cart, I'm making a call over to Redis and say, hey, store this in the cart, store this in the cart, store this in the cart, right? I have a Postgres database storing all this information for me. And I'm also using Stripe. So that means that I have secrets and API keys and all kinds of stuff happening that I want to make sure that I have access throughout all of my application. Now, I'm going to show you my front end again. Only for this reason, I'm going to open my app settings. I have nothing inside of my app settings. Nothing in my development or my regular app settings.json. There's nothing in there that's telling my application what exactly is happening or any configurations for talking to Redis, for talking to Stripe, for talking to the database, for making that API call. All that stuff has been configured for me using my local orchestrator. So I'm going to pop open that app host really quick, and let's take a look at this particular orchestrator for this app that I'm just showing you. Now, this has a lot more stuff in it. And so let's kind of pick and choose some of the things that we're going to take a look at. So let's start at the bottom, actually. So just as we saw before, right? I have access to a few .NET projects. I decided to call this in the front end, right? But I'm just getting access to this projects that Aspire Shop front end, right? Where did that name come from? Well, that's just the name of the project. Essentially, it really is all that it is, right? The catalog DB, anything that you see what this project's on, if you see me type projects dots, right? These are all of the projects that are referenced in my solution file, right? And so what we are able to get is like a strongly typed reference to those projects. If my project was not a part of the solution file, we could still add it. We'll just have to add, the CS project and the path. But the whole point is that now I have a variable that can point to those different projects, right? But again, you've seen this before. There's nothing interesting about that. Now, a couple things are running in terms of dependencies. Now, I created this extension. I created my own resource, essentially, to add Vault. I know folks are familiar with Vault, but Vault is a HashiCorp product. It essentially is something that you use to store keys in, right? So if you're familiar with Azure Key Vault, it's like the same thing, but this one runs in a container. Or you could run it in production in your own configuration, but I'm just running it locally, right? There's also Postgres database, and there's also a Redis database. Now, the support for Postgres and Redis, like I showed you in the previous slide, that was something that comes out of, not out of the box, but it comes as a part of that supported components list. So I can download a NuGet package, and I could say add Redis. I could say add Postgres. But when I run them, they're going to end up running as containers. If I open my, my Docker dashboard here as an example, I don't know if you can see that. Maybe I can control plus that a little bit, right? But here, you could see, I'll move that over, right? I'm running Redis, I'm running Postgres, I'm running Vault, right? I didn't write a Docker compose file. I didn't write any Docker files. All I did was add a reference with a NuGet package, and now I'm able to run these things on my machine, right? Which, again, I'm orchestrating it locally with, with .NET Aspire, which is great. Now, with Vault, Vault was not something that was in that supported list. So what I had to do was figure out, well, how do I run containers that are not on the list? Like, how do I get this thing started, right? And so if I take a look at my resource, what I did was I created a custom extension method and a custom resource, and I'll show what that resource looks like, so I can run HashiCorp Vault. So if you look at this class here, it's not a very complicated class, right? I have the default ports. This is just a dev token. This is essentially how I log into Vault, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second, right? And then I just have to create this thing called an endpoint reference, right? Endpoint reference is like, how do I connect to this thing? Like, what's the HTTP URL, right, that I need to connect to this thing? But this is it, right? This is all I needed to do to get started with like creating a resource. Now what I had to do is figure out, how do I wire this up to the local orchestrator? And this is what the code looks like to do that. It looks a little gnarly, but let's kind of walk through it together. So I created that Vault server resource, right? I'm just doing all of this here. Honestly, I'm just doing some string manipulation to like get the, I want this to listen on port 0000 or, endpoint 0000 using this, default container port. Here are some of the command line arguments that I want to pass to that container. Again, this all really has nothing to do with Aspire, but more so, what are the command flags I need to pass to this process or to this container to get it to run, right? So instead of me writing in the Docker container, I'm just writing it in code. And then now I want to return the builder. I'm going to add the resource. I'm going to give it the image I want it to pull, right? So, in Docker, you'll say from image. Well, here, we're inside of, we're inside of Aspire, right? We're inside of the orchestrator. So we say with image, I want you to pull it from the Docker registry. And then here's the port it should be at, the port I want to bind to locally, the port that is running in the container, and then the endpoint name. And then all this other stuff here is that I'm just setting environment variables. So again, I created a resource. I let it know what image I wanted to pull. I set some environment variables. I set the command line args to it. And then now all I have to do is just say, add Vault, right? And so now I have my own container running there. If you had a special tool that you run that's not in here, you could pretty much just copy paste this code and do the same thing, right? Assuming that it doesn't have any special requirements to it. So now if I head over to my browser, excuse me, and I think if I head to localhost, and I think it was 8200. I could be mistaken. Nope, it wasn't 8200. See, this is what you get when you try to cheat. Okay, here we go. It is this random port that got generated for me. I'm going to go to dev.roots, right? And now I've gone ahead and I've, here are my keys, right? These are the keys. I'm not going to show you what they are, but here are the keys that I'm using to make that call to Stripe, right? So I've just run a container. I've put some keys in it, right? And now when my application runs, I'm able to like look inside of this vault. It could be Azure Key Vault or Azure Configuration Service or whatever it is that you want to use. But I'm able to look inside of this thing, and now I can get access to these keys. But again, nothing special that we haven't done before. The interesting part comes when I want to add references to this to my front end. So you can notice here, in my front end, when again I get that strongly typed reference to my front end, I could say, hey, I want you to have access to this vault, right? So that means that I want my front end to be able to talk to that local container, development container, and I want you to be able to get secrets from it, right? Because I've set this up so that you can be able to say, hey, can I get the vault? And now I can be able to talk to it with my client, right? Hopefully that makes sense for folks. Let me know if it does or if it doesn't. Now, the other interesting part that we have here, like I mentioned to you, so we can run projects, we can run containers, we can even run executables. So here on line 7, what I'm showing you is, sorry if that like zoom in, zoom out is bouncing around a little bit too much. What I'm showing you is I have the option to add executable. Again, this is something that comes out of the box when you work with .NET Aspire. Now, when I call this operation, what I'm going to do is this is just the name of whatever we want to call it, the name of this executable resource. We can call this whatever we want. I'm going to say, I want you to run bash. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to run bash locally. I want you to run bash in the current directory, and I want you to run this vault setup script. And now in my app, I actually have a setup script. I'm not going to show you the whole script because it has secrets in it. But what this script does is it writes some stuff out to the console, but then I'm calling Vault and I'm saying, hey, I want you to set up a space called Aspire Shop. And then I want you to put some keys in here. So my public key and then my secret keys somewhere there later down, right? So that's how those secret keys got bootstrapped inside of that Vault container, right? I created a custom resource. I added it to the orchestrator. I wrote this script. Again, you don't have to write the script if you don't want to. I just chose to do it. But I wrote this script. I added it as a resource. And then now when I F5, it's going to run the script. It's going to set up the container. And then now it's going to give my application access to those secrets. And the only thing that I have to do is say, hey, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. If I go over to the front end, the only thing that I have to do is say, hey, where is it? It's somewhere at the top. Right, here we go. The only thing I have to do is say, hey, can I get these environment variables that I got access to whenever you created that, whenever I got access or whenever I got that reference to that Vault container, right? And so now I'm able to pull out the token, the mount point, all this types of stuff. And now I could pull those secrets into my application. But I don't have to pass them around. I don't have to have them in my app settings. You know what I mean? I can have them in a centralized place, and now I could just pass them around, which I think is a great option as well. One of the things that I want to try to do, I didn't get to it before we did this talk today. One of the things I want to try to do is see if I could create a resource for a .env file. If folks have ever worked with, again, env files and Docker files and stuff like that before, it's just a great way for you to pass around environment variables, right? And just a env.local or something like that. I'm going to try and create one of those and see what that looks like. Now, one of the things in Aspire that we have not spoken about, one of the projects you get, I'm going to close all these. We have a bunch of files open. One of the things that you get out of the box is a project called Service Defaults. Now, earlier in the talk, I was saying, when you Aspirify your application, there's a certain amount of things you get by default. OpenTelemetry is wired up by default, right? Metrics and health checks and stuff like that, it gets wired up by default. How does that happen? Well, there's some code that gets added to a project inside of your application. That code is called the service defaults. And inside of there, it's essentially like a collection of opinionated extension methods and setup to add a lot of these, features to your application. So if I was supposed to zoom in here really quickly, I don't know why I feel like this font has just gotten smaller. Maybe it's me. Anyway, if you take a look inside of, the extensions.cs file inside of service defaults, what you'll notice is that, on that first line, I have configure OpenTelemetry. If we kind of click through that and see what's going on there, here at the bottom, again, I didn't write any of this code, right? This code just kind of came along for the ride. We have that setup of saying, hey, add metrics, add logging, add tracing. But this code only happens once, right? And then now inside of each of your projects, it just kind of lights up, which is great. Very similar thing when we look at health checks, right? If I look at, add default health checks, there's a default health check in here. Same thing with like some of these other endpoints as well, right? There's just, excuse me, a collection of very opinionated, but also code that you're probably going to write for yourself, and you're probably going to write it more than once. We don't really have to do that. Now, some folks have asked, well, why wasn't this a package, and why is it just another project with code in it? Well, the main reason for that is that you have the option to, one, this thing is not magic, right? Like it's not a, oh, hey, we're just going to start, sharing metrics and logs and stuff about your application without you knowing. It's not magic. But also, you have the option to come in and change some of these defaults. You can add and remove some of the instrumentation if you want. If you go to health check, I remember there was a debate online. Should this be called /health? Should it be called /status? Should it be called /whatever? You know what? You could change it to be whatever you want it to be, right? You could put it under a subpath if you want it to be. You could, you can add more health checks to this if you wanted to, right? The code is here for you to change and update as much as you want. But then now you don't have to worry about, well, how do I wire up OpenTelemetry in my app? How do I wire up health checks in my app? How do I, do, I think we also have a extension method that adds resiliency. We talked about resiliency a little bit. Here's one that adds like some basic resiliency handlers and service discovery to HTTP client, right? You don't have to wire that up every single time. By default, it'll just be available for all of your different applications, and you can make use of them, however you see fit. Or you could turn them on or turn them off, whatever it is that you decide to do. But again, the whole thing with Aspire is that now the puzzle pieces are trying to come together, right? It's not, how do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do that? It's, well, I can reach for these different pieces and I can pick and choose the ones I want. And now I already have a little bit of a head start to get, put these options together so we could start building these distributed applications. And I think that's one of the great things that we have. Again, working with .NET and working with Aspire in this space. So again, I am going to head over here. Let's head back over to the slides really quickly. So again, I think the things I want you to remember, the things I want you to take out of this talk, and this was a little bit of a whirlwind review of what Aspire is and what Aspire can do. But again, when it comes to building microservices locally, when it comes to you setting up multiple projects and project dependencies, this is where Aspire and the orchestrator and the service discovery support and the resiliency support all can kind of come together and make your life so much more easier as a developer. There is a component to it that does deployment. I didn't really talk about that because I wasn't going to deploy anything today. But, Aspire itself is not something that you deploy, right? Again, it's a local development tool. It's a local development resource, at least when it comes to the orchestrated part of it. When you build your project and you publish it, it will generate a manifest file, and that manifest file can be interpreted by different tools. If you've seen any of the demos on YouTube or read any of the documentation, if you use the Azure Developer CLI, it's able to look at that output and provision your Azure resources for you. It will generate that bicep for you. It will deploy those things in Azure for you if you wanted to. But if you don't, feel free to go ahead and use it as a local development tool so you can see how much easier it is for you to get into this microservice world and you building these different distributed applications. And then just, again, being more productive because, again, you have the choice of picking and choosing what's going on, and you don't have to spend so much time worrying about configuration and plugging things together, right? Things that are kind of already plugged together for you a little bit, right? Now you have a little bit less work to do to kind of deal with that. So with that being said, again, I'm going to pause for a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know, thoughts and concerns, and if there's stuff that you're trying out or thinking about. If you're wondering if Aspire can plug into your application, definitely let me know. I can hang around for a little bit, and then we could talk about it.
Anyone have any questions or comments for Cecil? So I think Rick, excuse me, Rick beat me to the punch by saying that it was a very nice presentation. Completely agree. Also, the technology and having everything in one-stop shopping and all your components, I thought that was really cool. What I really liked as well was where you said there's no YAML, there's no XML, there's no JSON, everything is in C#. I'm like, yes, finally, that's how it should be. So yeah, I was applauding here, and but I was on mute, so I wouldn't disrupt anybody.
Yeah, I think again when it comes to entry for us as .NET developers in that space, there's just YAML is the thing, right? Like, and that's what a lot of folks do in that world, and I get it, right? Because for folks that work in the microservice space, it's very common for you not to just rely on one programming language, right? Like, you're using Python and Go and this and that and this and that, and everybody does things differently. So for them, we get it. YAML or configuration is just like a general default. Like, we can rely on configuration, and then you on your side, you could figure out how to interpret that and deal with it. But we're .NET developers and we're a little spoiled. The world's a little bit different for us. You know what I mean? And we like to rely on tooling to do a lot of that for us. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That is kind of our pedigree, right? Like, we rely on the tooling so that we can be productive faster. And so what we've gotten now is the tooling, right? We've gotten the tooling, and we've gotten the tooling in a way that it's not magical. It's something that we can understand, which is C#. It runs. It's .NET Run project. Things, the muscle memory that we're already used to, we're able to apply that now in a completely different space, right? And so it's given us options. It's given us the choice to be able to play into this world in a little bit of an easier way, so to speak. So hopefully, hopefully folks will try it out. It's still preview, like I mentioned. Sometimes things work and sometimes they don't, but most of the time they do. But there's a Discord channel that I'm in, randomly asking questions and answering questions myself. And there's also the GitHub. You can go and open issues and things of that nature. So feel free. Turner's asking a question. Is there an option for the configuration file to be generated? Excuse me. Which configuration file specifically are you talking about, Turner? Let me know. And you can ask that. Or, I mean, you're here. If you want to unmute, feel free to unmute and let me know which one you're talking about.
I guess my question was more, is there a way for a config file to be generated via Aspire?
A config file for what? Like any type of config file, you mean, or?
I guess, like similar to like a Docker compose file. Like, is this, does it generate a compose file like for Docker, or is it strictly via all tooling?
Okay, so in terms of the local dev stuff, it doesn't generate a Docker compose file for you at all, right? Like, everything just kind of happens in the backend. I don't know if you remember, I think it was .NET 7. .NET 7 released the ability for you to just .NET publish to Docker, right? And with no Docker file needed, it just kind of automatically does it for you. It's like kind of built into the framework now. But for the containers that are running as well, right? Like, you can also very easily just reference containers that live somewhere else. Like, I'm gonna go back and show you the ones that I was using. So if I pop over to, again, this one that I added to Vault, when I did it, I just said, hey, I want you to, this is the name of the container, this is where it is, it's in Docker, go pull it down for me, right? And I want you to go ahead and run it. But if you're talking about deployment now, and not just local dev, and you're asking, hey, can I deploy this thing, and will you generate a Docker compose file for me? No, it will not do that for you. There is a plugin. So there's a couple of plugins for deployment. There's one called Aspirate, I believe it's what it's called. Let's go ahead and let's Google Bing this together. Aspire 8 is what it's called. And is that it? That's not it. Aspire 8. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is there's this thing that you could use, and it will let you. Is this it? Is this a GitHub page? I'm trying to find a GitHub page for this thing. Anyway, there's a thing that you could use, and what it will do is that it will generate your excuse me, your Kubernetes manifest file for you. Why can I not find the GitHub page for this thing? It will generate your Kubernetes manifest file for you, which is great. Maybe this is it. Is this it? This can't be it because this is a demo. Anyway, it will generate your, if you look up Aspirate and .NET Aspire, it will generate your Kubernetes manifest file for you. If you're trying to deploy to AWS, there's AWS support as well. So again, you'd have to add the AWS component. Actually, I think if I go into the Aspire docs, right, it does have that option as well. I think that one was added in, if we go to what's new, is it in this one? I think it was added in Preview 5 because Preview 6 is very new. Right, there we go. So Preview 5, which is the previous preview, it will generate, I think it's called CloudFormation templates for you for AWS. And then if you're going to Azure, it will generate a manifest file that the Azure Developer CLI will then generate Bicep for you that you can deploy. So that's what I was asking, like when you mean configuration file, if you're talking about configuration files for deployment, Aspire itself will not do it for you. But there are plugins and there's support that you could, again, you can add on like NuGet packages that will, create those deployment artifacts for you. So you could look at them, or you could just have it deployed for you if you wanted to. But there's nothing for Docker Compose specifically, because I know you asked for Docker Compose. It doesn't have anything specific for Docker Compose today.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering.
Sure.
Can you paste that link in the chat?
Which one? This one that I'm looking at right now?
Yeah, please.
Sure, I will do that. Excuse me, right now. Yeah, this is just the official documentation. Yeah, if you're looking at the docs, like there's a what's new section, and then it will tell you what's new in each of the previews as soon as the previews are released. Preview 6 came out on Wednesday, last week Wednesday. So, I was like, oh, I gotta update my demo to make sure that it works in the latest preview. If folks are wondering where they could see the demo that I showed, it is over on my GitHub. And it is, I'll paste this link in here as well. I'll paste this in the chat as well. This is the repo. So this repo originally came from the, the .NET repo. I forked it and added my own stuff to it. So if we click on this and we go to the Stripe one, inside of samples, and this is the shop, and so this is what I showed everyone tonight. So inside of the Stripe branch, right? But if you wanted to, yeah, feel free to look at some of the other ones. There's samples here, like I mentioned, for Node.js. There's samples for using Microsoft Orleans if folks use Orleans, for using Dapper, or if you're using, some JavaScript thing with NPM and things of that nature, like you have the options to connect all of those things as well. But I think the main thing there for me is like, it does not have to be a part of your solution file, which is great if you're doing things in like a monorepo. A lot of folks like working in monorepos. If you're working in a monorepo or just a bunch of different repos, you want to clone them down in your machine and do stuff, all you really need is a file path. Right? Give me the path to where this project is, and then Aspire can orchestrate that for you, whether it's a .NET project or not.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions or comments? Either verbally or in chat. All right, looks like all questions have been answered. Once again, thank you, Cecil. Job well done, and very cool product, or excuse me, stack.
Yeah, it's very cool. Folks, definitely head over and check it out. And yeah, I think now is a good time to get in, only because as you find bugs and issues or just opportunities to help out, you know what I mean? Like you could be a part of the grounds of, this open source project. I like, playing out with new open source projects, just, to get that contributor muscle flexing a little bit. But then also you think about if this is how .NET developers are going to be building microservices, you'll have the option to be able to influence some of that. And I think that's a great thing that we could all get involved in.
Absolutely. Completely agreed. All right. If you don't mind, I'm going to take back the screen for some concluding slides.
All yours.
Thank you. I also pasted several links in the chat window, and we'll cover those in just a little bit. So primarily, you see that you'll have the links for the special offer from Manning.com, which is a 35% off a selection of books. Also, you have the feedback eval form. And then in addition, there's also links for the YouTube channel as well as the blog, which will have all the tech events that we'll cover in just a second. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And now, all right. So as far as the YouTube, the link is, the link is posted in the chat. If you would please subscribe to the channel to get upload notifications. Same thing with the blog. And there we'll be posting the tech events that we'll cover in just a second. And last but not least, the feedback eval form so we can provide Cecil with some constructive criticism. With regards to the tech events, so these are regional events. As far as the user groups, they're all held online virtually. So on May 2nd is the TwinCities.net user group. And then on May 7th is the Ohio North Database Training Group, and that is the first Tuesday of every month. And then on May 8th is the Azure Cleveland user group, which is the second Wednesday of the month. And then the Greater Lansing user group for .NET users, that's going to be on the third Thursday, or in May will be May 16th. And last but not least, May 22nd will be the Cleveland C# user group meeting, aka this meeting. As far as conferences, on May 3rd is Stir Trek, that's going to be held in Columbus. On June 27th through the 28th is the Kansas City Developer Conference, and as you might have guessed, held in Kansas City. And on July 26th is Cincy Deliver. That is a one-day event that's held in Cincinnati that will have a variety of topics related to various languages, as well as agile topics. And so you can check them out at the link. You can check them out at the link posted on the slide, which is also on my blog. Lastly, if you have any other questions after the meeting, you can reach me at snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find me on Twitter, the link to my blog once again. And lastly, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so. And so with that, thanks again to Cecil for joining us and doing a great job on presenting Aspire. And thank you all for joining us as well, and look forward to seeing you next month. Good night, everyone.
Night, everybody.